In the fall of 1919, baseball was not just a game in America. It was the closest thing the country had to a shared religion. After 4 years of World War, after a flu pandemic that killed more Americans than the war itself, people needed something clean, something honest, something that could not be bought. They believed they had found it on the diamond. They were wrong. Because that October, the best team in the country walked onto the field having already decided to lose. 8 men in the same uniform had made a quiet agreement with a group of gamblers. They would throw the World Series. They would betray the millions of people watching, and they would do it in plain sight, in front of packed stadiums, with reporters in the press box and children in the stands.
Sports writer Hugh Fullerton smells a rat. He suggests in the New York Evening World that White Sox players were fixing the World Series. A claim that casts a deep shadow on the national pastime.
This is the story of how 8 baseball players fixed the World Series, how one of the greatest hitters who ever lived was banished forever, and how a single scandal forced an entire sport to invent a new kind of power just to survive. It is also a story about money, money that was promised, and money that, for most of these men, never actually came. This is the Black Sox. To understand why these men did it, you first have to understand what they were. The 1919 Chicago White Sox were not a good team. They were a great one, arguably the best in baseball. They had won the World Series 2 years earlier in 1917. They were stacked with talent at almost every position.
They won a world championship in 1906, won a world championship in 1917. And observers were saying that this might be the best team ever assembled by any owner.
And going into the series against the Cincinnati Reds, the smart money, the betting money, everyone assumed Chicago would win easily. But beneath that talent was a clubhouse full of resentment. And at the center of that resentment was one man, the team's owner, Charles Comiskey. Comiskey was rich, powerful, and famously cheap. While other owners paid their stars properly, Comiskey paid his players some of the lowest salaries in the league, even as they filled his ballpark and won him championships. The stories about him became legend. He reportedly promised pitcher Eddie Cicotte a bonus if he won 30 games in a season. As Cicotte closed in on that number, the team allegedly benched him to make sure he fell short. The bonus was never paid. Players were charged for cleaning their own uniforms. The food was poor, and the contracts were locked tight by a system that gave players almost no freedom to leave or negotiate. This is the soil the scandal grew in. These were not pampered millionaires. They were skilled working men who felt cheated by the man who profited most from them. That feeling does not excuse what came next, but it explains why, when temptation arrived, the door was already half open.
Behind the scenes of this wonderful game lurked a very sinister dark side.
The American psyche has been damaged at bargain basement prices.
The idea did not come from the top. It came from inside the clubhouse. The first mover was the team's first baseman, Chick Gandil. Gandil had connections to the gambling world, and he understood something simple and dangerous. A World Series is decided by a handful of men: the pitcher who grooves a fastball, the fielder who is half a step slow, the hitter who swings at a bad pitch in a key moment. If enough of those men agreed to fail at the right times, the outcome of the most watched event in American sport could be quietly steered.
That was when they discussed, how do we do this? How do we actually go about fixing a game without being caught, without looking foolish? That was when Cicotte said, "We're expert ball players. We can do this."
Gandil reached out to a gambler named Sport Sullivan, and the plan began to take shape. The players would lose the series on purpose. In exchange, they wanted a fortune. The number that gets repeated is $100,000, split among the men involved. In 1919, that was life-changing money, several times what most of them earned in a year. But a scheme this size needed real financing. And that financing traced back to one of the most powerful figures in the American underworld, a New York gambler named Arnold Rothstein.
Arnold Rothstein was a Manhattan racketeer, a genius figure who had come up to command the Jewish faction of organized crime in New York City.
He's a money lender. He provides finance of hit Broadway shows, speakeasies and rum running, and the international drug trade. And if muscle has to be applied, it will be applied.
Rothstein is one of the most important and most slippery figures in this entire story. He had the money and the connections to move bets this large without crashing the odds. The conspiracy ran through middlemen who orbited him, men like the former boxing champion Abe Attell and other gamblers like Bill Burns and Billy Maharg, who moved between the players and the cash. Rothstein himself kept his distance. He let others do the talking, took his position quietly, and made sure that almost nothing could ever be traced back to him. That structure matters, because it tells you who was really in control. The players thought they were running a clever scheme. In truth, they were the most exposed people in the entire operation, and the men holding the money were the safest. By the time the series began, the circle had grown to 8 White Sox players. Chick Gandil, the organizer; Eddie Cicotte, the team's ace pitcher; Claude Williams, another key pitcher; Oscar Felsch, the center fielder; Charles Risberg, the shortstop; Fred McMullen, a reserve infielder who reportedly found out and demanded to be cut in; Buck Weaver, the third baseman; and the biggest name of them all, Shoeless Joe Jackson.
Joe was a natural ball player. He could do it all. He could throw, he could hit, he could run the bases.
The 1919 World Series was a best of 9 that year, not the best of 7 we know today. Cincinnati needed 5 wins. So did Chicago. And from the very first pitch of the very first game, there was a signal. The story goes that Eddie Cicotte agreed to confirm the fix was on by hitting the first Cincinnati batter with a pitch. In Game 1, that is exactly what happened. The very first batter was struck. To the gamblers in the know, it was confirmation. The deal was real. The money was working. What followed was a strange and uneven performance. At times, the White Sox played like the great team they were. At other times, they made errors, threw poorly, and let easy chances slip away in ways that were hard to explain for the best team in the sport. Cicotte, normally precise, made costly mistakes. Williams, who could pitch with pinpoint control, lost games in ways that did not match his record. But the fix was never clean, and that is one of the most human parts of this story, because the money was not arriving the way it had been promised. The players had been told the cash would come in installments as the series went on. It did not. Payments were late, smaller than agreed, or simply did not appear. Some of the men grew angry. Some wanted to back out. At one point, the players who felt betrayed by the gamblers reportedly started actually trying to win just to spite the men who had stiffed them. The series swung. Chicago clawed back. The conspiracy nearly collapsed in real time. Not because of conscience, because of a money dispute between cheaters. In the end, Cincinnati won the World Series 5-3. The underdogs had beaten the favorites. And almost immediately, the whispers began. Reporters who covered the games had seen things that did not add up. Gamblers in the know had bet heavy on Cincinnati and won. The fix had been one of the worst-kept secrets in the country, and the secret would not stay buried.
Charles Kaminsky told his secretary to go to Cleveland. He gave him a blank check and he said, "Bring Jackson back. I don't care what I have to pay for him. We need Joe Jackson."
For nearly a year, the story simmered. Rumors circulated. Sports writers hinted at it. But there was no proof, and baseball had every reason to look the other way. The sport was popular, profitable, and protective of its own image. Then, in 1920, the structure cracked open. A separate gambling investigation in Chicago began pulling at threads, and those threads led back to the 1919 World Series. A grand jury was convened, and under the pressure of questioning, the wall of silence broke. Two of the players, Eddie Cicotte and Joe Jackson, reportedly gave statements describing the fix. Cicotte is said to have broken down and admitted his role. The details spilled out, and the country, which had wanted so badly to believe its game was pure, now had to face the idea that the World Series itself, the showcase of the entire sport, had been sold. For Chicago fans, the wound was specific and brutal. There's a famous moment, almost certainly exaggerated over the years, of a young boy approaching Joe Jackson outside the courthouse and pleading with him, "Say it ain't so, Joe." Whether those exact words were ever spoken is doubtful, and Jackson himself denied the scene as it is usually told. But it endured because it captured something true, a child's faith in his hero broken in public, the feeling of an entire country being told that the thing they trusted was a lie. In 1921, 8 White Sox players went on trial. On paper, the case looked strong. There were confessions, there were gamblers, there was a losing team that had been heavily favored to win. And then something remarkable happened. The signed confessions that the players had reportedly given to the grand jury went missing. They simply disappeared from the legal record. Without those documents, the case fell apart. When the verdict came, the jury acquitted all 8 men. Reports from the time described players and jurors celebrating together afterward, as if a great injustice had just been corrected. If the story had ended there, the Black Sox might be remembered very differently, as men who were accused, tried, and cleared. The legal system had spoken. By the standard of a criminal court, they were innocent. But baseball was about to make one thing very clear. It answered to a different judge. Here's the part of the story that changed the sport forever, far beyond the fate of any single player. Before this scandal, professional baseball was governed by a committee of owners. It was a system built to protect business interests, not integrity. And it had failed catastrophically. The owners had heard the rumors. They had reasons to suspect something was wrong. And they had done nothing, because doing nothing was good for business. The Black Sox scandal exposed that failure to the entire country. If baseball wanted to survive as something Americans could believe in, it could not be policed by the very men who profited from looking away. It needed a single authority, someone outside the ownership group, someone with the power to act without asking permission, someone whose only job was to protect the integrity of the game itself. So baseball created a new office, the commissioner.
The players get a mysterious break when the confessions go missing. The jury finds them not guilty. Baseball Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis is not so lenient. he punishes all 8 with a lifetime ban.
The first man to hold it was a federal judge named Kennesaw Mountain Landis. He was severe, theatrical, and absolute in his sense of authority. And the owners, desperate to clean up the sport's image, handed him sweeping power. Power to investigate, power to punish, power to act in whatever he alone judged to be the best interests of baseball. Landis understood exactly what the moment required. He understood that a not guilty verdict in a courtroom was not enough to restore public trust. The country needed to see that baseball would police itself with a severity the courts had not. So the day after the players were acquitted, Landis issued his own judgment, and it did not care about the verdict at all. He banned all 8 players from professional baseball for life. His reasoning became one of the most famous statements in the history of American sport. Regardless of any court verdict, no player who threw a game, no player who agreed to throw a game, and no player who sat in a room with crooked gamblers discussing how to throw games and then kept quiet about it would ever play professional baseball again.
Rothstein walked away untouchable. But not everyone would be so lucky. On October 29th, 1920, 8 White Sox players and a handful of low-level gamblers were indicted and charged with conspiracy to defraud the public.
That last part is crucial, and it is where this story turns from a crime drama into a tragedy. Because not all 8 men were the same. Take Buck Weaver, the third baseman. By most accounts, Weaver never took money and never played to lose. The evidence suggests he played the series honestly, and his statistics back that up. His sin, in the eyes of the commissioner, was different. He had been in the room, he had heard the plan, and he had not reported it. For that silence alone, he was banned for life, alongside the men who actually sold the games. For the rest of his life, Weaver maintained his innocence and petitioned again and again to be reinstated. He was refused every time. He died, still banned. And then there is the name that has haunted this story for more than a century: Shoeless Joe Jackson. Jackson was one of the purest hitters the game has ever seen, and his performance in the 1919 World Series is the great contradiction at the heart of his case. In a series he supposedly helped throw, Jackson hit better than anyone on either team. He set a record for hits in the series. He did not commit a single error in the field. By every visible measure, he played like a man trying to win. And yet, Jackson reportedly accepted money and reportedly knew about the fix. He could read his own statements only with great difficulty, having never learned to read and write well, and that fact has fueled endless debate about how much he truly understood of what he was signing and agreeing to. Defenders point to his numbers and his background and argue he was a simple man swept up in something he barely grasped. Critics point out that he took the cash and stayed silent. The truth probably lives somewhere in the uncomfortable space between those two stories. What is not in doubt is the price he paid. One of the greatest talents in the history of the game was thrown out of it forever at the peak of his powers. And to this day, he remains barred from the Hall of Fame. The numbers say he belongs among the immortals. The ban says he never will. And here is the final, bitter irony that ties the whole story together. These men risked everything: their careers, their reputations, their place in history. They sold the most sacred event in their sport. And for most of them, the payoff barely existed. Remember, the grand promise was around $100,000 to be split among the group. But the money never flowed the way it was supposed to. Payments came late, came short, or never came at all. The gamblers, the men who actually walked away rich from betting on the outcome, had little reason to honor a deal with players who could never go to the police without confessing their own crime. That was the trap. The players had no power to demand payment, because demanding payment meant admitting guilt. So they were robbed twice, once by the system that underpaid them for years, and again by the gamblers who used them, won fortunes on their disgrace, and then left them holding almost nothing. Eddie Cicotte reportedly received a payment hidden under his pillow. Joe Jackson reportedly received a fraction of what was discussed. Others got less, or nothing. The men who organized the financing and made the real money mostly faced no serious consequences at all. Arnold Rothstein, the financier whose money made it possible, was never convicted of anything connected to the fix. He had built the operation precisely so that the risk fell on the players and the reward flowed to him. The 8 men who actually played the games lost their livelihoods, their legacies, and in many cases gained almost nothing in return. They gambled their entire futures. And the house, as it almost always does, kept the winnings. So what did this scandal actually change? It changed how baseball governs itself. The office of the commissioner, created in the wreckage of 1919, still exists today, still wields enormous power, and still rests on the same founding idea, that a sport is only as valuable as the public's belief that its results are real. Every modern rule about gambling, every lifetime ban handed down for betting on the game, every line a player cannot cross, traces back in spirit to the lesson learned here. Once people stop believing the outcome is honest, the entire thing is worth nothing. It changed how we think about the gap between guilt and justice. A criminal court found these men not guilty. The game banned them for life anyway. And more than 100 years later, people still argue about whether that was fair, especially for the man who hit 375 and the man who never took a dime. And it left behind a question that still hangs over sports today. How much do we really want to know about the games we love? The fans of 1919 wanted to believe. The owners wanted to look away. The players wanted easy money. And the gamblers were happy to sell all of them exactly what they wanted, right up until the moment the whole thing fell apart. 8 men walked onto a baseball field, having already decided to lose. They thought they were getting rich. Instead, they lost everything, and the sport they betrayed rebuilt itself on the ashes of their choice. That is the story of the Black Sox, the greatest team money could barely pay, the fix that almost no one could keep secret, and the scandal that forced a sport to invent a new kind of power just to be believed in again.
When I was found innocent, I was still banned for life. I can say that my conscience is clear, and I'll stand on my record in that World Series. I'm willing to let the Lord be my judge.